Hello and welcome everyone to this new series of the Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period webinar series. My name is Kirk Higgins. I'm the Senior Manager for Education here at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And I'm Rachel Davison Humphries, the Director of Outreach here at our offices in Arlington, Virginia.
And this week we are joined by Dr. Jeffry Morrison. Dr. Morrison is a professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, and director of academics at the federal government's James Madison Foundation in Alexandria, Virginia. He graduated with distinction from Boston College and from Georgetown University, where he earned the MA and PhD in government. He has published as author or editor 5 books on American political culture, including The Political Philosophy of George Washington and The Reagan Manifesto. Welcome, Dr. Morrison.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you. So this week we're talking about social contracts. So we figured it's towards the beginning of the school year, although it's already October, but we wanted to start with a foundational conversation.
Right.
And so by way of sort of a bell ringer in our virtual classroom here, we thought we'd just think for a moment about how the three of us are kind of in a social contract.
Yeah, so what brought us here? And what are the rules that we've already established by being in this conversation together? What do you think?
Right. So I think there's some tacit rules and some that we've agreed upon.
Right.
So we got in contact with Dr. Morrison, and he willingly
graciously.
or unwillingly, agreed to join us at a specific time.
Right. In a specific place. And there are a bunch of rules that we have that are implicit to what we're doing that we didn't have to make explicit. Like you and I aren't going to talk over one another. We're
Right.
going to make space because we're the interviewers. Dr. Morrison is going to answer questions and not ask us as many. We're going to ask him the questions.
Right. So we've kind of already stepped out of our state of nature,
Right.
and found ourselves in some sort of a political medium where we're able to interact and get along with each other and hopefully have a productive conversation.
And then there are a whole bunch of rules that are for the audience too.
Right.
So we are expecting that the audience is our teachers or individuals out in the world who are interested in this topic. Why would you be logging in otherwise? And also that you're going to ask us questions and prompt us in a direction that makes sense for you. The way you can do that is we have a number of different channels. If you want to reach out to us on Facebook right now, it's Facebook/Bill of Rights Institute. If you want to reach out to us on Twitter, it's Twitter/BR Institute. Or if you just want to use the comment box feature on this live webinar, that'll be tracked live as this is replayed by people who watch it in the future and can add to those comments. So we're expecting that when you do that, you're going to ask questions that are relevant. And we have a set of rules that we don't have to explain because they're already there about how those comments will go. So in all those ways, we've entered into a number of arrangements on a number of different levels.
Which I think foundationally comes down to consent.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So I think that we think it's sort of an interesting way to set up a classroom, because I think it's useful for students to be in a position where they are directly experiencing with their own physical being what it means to be in that relationship without it being abstract, because social contract theory does seem like a very lofty idea, I think.
And it is and it isn't. I mean, that's what makes it interesting, is that it is this very deep philosophical principle, which we'll get to, but it also is kind of an explanation of how we interact in a free society, right? That there are these rules that we follow that are laid down, but not really, because we didn't enter into a formal contract. There's a social contract. So what does that mean?
Right.
Is what we'll discuss today.
Absolutely. So, and I'm sure there's different ways of looking at it.
Yeah.
But Dr. Morrison, can you help us sort of understand what is social contract theory, and sort of where does it come from?
Sure. Well, that word theory, which you just mentioned, Kirk, tips us off to the fact that it is a political theory. It is a way of trying to understand how we humans arrived at the state where we find ourselves now, namely in a state of society, and also in a state, almost all of us, of government. Anarchy just doesn't seem to work very well. So human beings tend to relate to one another in patterns of authority and submission and legitimacy and so forth. So those are kind of distinct, actually, the state of society and the state of government, you might say. But it's an attempt to understand, a theoretical attempt to understand kind of how we got to where we are today. And it just does seem to be true, doesn't it, of human beings worldwide and across the centuries. And it truly is a human, it seemed to be a human characteristic that we associate ourselves together. We're social creatures. We're creatures who need government to survive. Order, as the great 20th century political philosopher Simone Weil once said, order is the first need of all. So how is it that we got to this state? That's kind of what social contract theory is. It's a theory trying to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And again, sort of getting into the foundational elements of this, right? I mean, it's a way, almost a way of thinking about our surroundings so that we can better articulate what government might look like. It sort of lays down that foundation that we can then build upon in order to have a free society.
Yeah, so in addition to being theoretical, and that branch of study we generally call political theory or political philosophy, it's also kind of a theory of history, actually. And the Enlightenment practitioners or theoreticians of the social contract, and their names that probably will be familiar to those in our audience who are educators. And by the way, I should say as an aside, I love teachers. We really appreciate what you do. I know I'm speaking for BRI and I myself. And Kirk, you mentioned I'm the academic director of a federal foundation that works with high school, secondary school teachers. And so I suspect that you all in the audience are familiar with some of these names like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and David Hume. These are all British Enlightenment thinkers, and German Enlightenment thinkers like Pufendorf. And in France, someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All of these Enlightenment era thinkers were also trying to craft a theory of history. And evidently they literally believed that there was a time, if we could go back far enough in human history or prehistory, because it technically means, history technically means the advent of writing, doesn't it? And then going forward, that we would find individuals who were not really associated in social groups, in communities. And that at some point in our human history, individuals made a conscious decision. We're going to leave that state of society, that state of nature, because it's intolerable or violent or inconvenient. All these different words are used, brutish. Thomas Hobbes has maybe the most famous formulation in which he says, life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, an acquaintance of mine joked one time, I think there's actually a DC law firm that's that name, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But for no matter how you characterize it, we don't want to stay there. Our ancestors didn't want to stay in that kind of a state of nature. It was one in which they had complete freedom, and every right you can imagine was held by those ancient ancestors of ours. But that's no way to live, right? Without government, without community, even without society. And so they made a conscious decision to move out of that and to make a bargain with one another, and to say, we'll give up some of our rights, some of the rights we have in a state of nature, which are called a variety of things, but natural rights is one of them. And so we'll give up some of those to buy some security. So it's a kind of balancing of security and liberty. And you were asking a little bit earlier, Kirk, or suggesting anyway, and you too, Rachel, in that thought experiment right at the beginning, or the bell ringer, as you called it, we're always trying to balance those two, aren't we? Security and liberty. Maybe we got to give up some of our rights, from time to time to purchase a little more security. And that's, according to these social contract theorists, at least the modern ones, the ones sort of from the Enlightenment to the present. By the way, it's not gone away, this social contract. The recently late John Rawls utilized it in some of his writings. And so theory and a theory of history, but also trying to understand, again, how we got to where we are today.
So what was, maybe we can pivot a little bit to the American founding period.
Sure.
And why this theory captivated, or why it was part of the milieu of the discussions happening. So what made social contract theory such an important foundational theory for those thinkers at the founding?
Yes. I think it was really important during the sort of revolutionary phase of our founding. I myself happen to think that the revolution and the revolutionary and constitutional moments are related to one another. They're integrally related to one another. But academic historians tend to separate them out a little bit. And so if we follow their lead, particularly in the revolutionary moment of the founding, social contract theory is very important because you both alluded to it earlier. Consent is a concept that almost necessarily goes along with that social contract. So does equality, by the way, equality of persons. Everybody is equal in a state of nature before there's a society, before there's a pecking order, before there's an aristocracy, titles, or anything like that. Everybody is equal in a state of nature, radically equal.
Can I pause that for a second?
Sure.
Can you go dive a little deeper for that? Because I think that many students would say that in a state of nature, might makes right. So the way you are, so what do you mean by equal when you say that they are equal in the state of nature?
Nobody has any more rights than anybody else. Nobody has any more authority than anybody else. There's no caste system. There are no classes. There's no anything really, except for this raw individuality, right?
Right.
So that's what I mean. Are people equal in the sense that they were all in a state of nature, the exact same height or weight or athletic ability, no, of course not. And we never have been. Not identical, but equal, and it's a good question, Rachel, equal in terms of, as I say, authority and rights in particular. So if you're all equal to one another, then the only legitimate way to move into some kind of society would be through consent. Everybody would have to agree to that, wouldn't they? And so consent becomes very important in the social contract. Equality of all people, that's very important in the social contract. And of course, those are two things, aren't they, that are front and center in the Declaration of Independence of 1776, in much of the rhetoric, the pamphlet rhetoric and so forth that precedes in the run-up to the revolution. So in the revolutionary moment in particular, and if we want to name some names here, John Locke is very important in the revolutionary period. He's not quite as important in the constitutional period or moment. And there have been some very good and careful studies done by historians and political theorists, actually citing the number of times that certain individuals or groups are referred to as authorities. The Bible would be one, the Enlightenment thinkers would be another. And then they start to even break them down by name. And it turns out John Locke is cited and mentioned many, many, many times during the revolution, and not nearly so often in that constitutional period. Why is that? Because Locke is talking about, yes, equality, consent. He's also talking about a right to resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Once you've moved from that state of nature into a state of society, and then into a state where there's a government within society, is there ever a time when you have a right, or maybe even a duty, to resist that government if it becomes tyrannical? In his phrase, if there's a long train of abuses. And so the draftsmen of the Declaration of Independence lift that language word for word out of John Locke and put it into the Declaration. So there's one instance, I think, of how the social contract theory plays out in our American founding. It's on the ground. You know, it's not just merely this kind of ivory tower theory or semi-myth, you know, about the distant past. All those Enlightenment thinkers really believed that is how humanity moved from its earliest stages into the sort of state in which we find ourselves today.
I think that's really interesting, and it seems though that influence of Locke doesn't go away. I'm thinking now of the preamble of the Constitution, right? We, the people of the United States, but even more so in the rhetoric of the Federalists during the ratification debate. So first Federalist paper written by Alexander Hamilton comes to mind, where he says, "You are invited to deliberate upon a new Constitution of the United States." And it seems to me that invitation itself seems to be elucidating this thought of consent, right? It's we as a society in some sort of representative form are going to deliberate upon this. So it seems like his influence is still tacitly there, if nothing else. Maybe that foundation of the Declaration is now influencing the construction of the Constitution.
Yeah, that's a nice point. And if we just refresh our memories for a moment, the Constitution was written in secret, wasn't it? And the convention was held over 4 very hot months in the summer of 1787, literally with the windows shut in what we call Independence Hall, maybe even nailed shut, sometimes with the curtains drawn. So it was done behind closed doors and closed windows. But then once it was crafted, it was then made public, wasn't it? It was sent out to each of the governors of the then 13 states with instructions that those states call special elections, hold special elections to delegate a convention, a ratifying convention, to hash it out in public, to fight about it, to write about it. And there are pamphlet wars and all kinds of things. And that's what the Federalists' context is. It's part of this pamphlet war. And in essence, the framers of the Constitution say, we did our work, we did the best we could behind closed doors, but we're not forcing this down anybody's throat. You're going to vote on it. You are free to vote it up or vote it down. We've done our best. Now it's up to you, the people, because for our founders, this was to be and always should be a regime of popular sovereignty. The people are sovereigns. So consent, you bet, consent in the ratification process. And that's, I think, one reason Hamilton mentions it right away in that first Federalist paper, as you pointed out.
Well, that's a lot to think about already in our first couple of minutes here on the webinar. I want to remind everyone that you can send us your questions. So please type them into the comment section on our YouTube channel, or if you want to reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter, we have Facebook/Bill of Rights Institute, and our Twitter account is /BR Institute. So moving on, I think at the founding period, there were, the social contract was part of the milieu, as part of the foundational kind of conceptual framework in which the revolutionary period was happening. How did it influence, I think we were starting to touch on this, how did it continue to influence into modern, or into today, into where we are culturally today? How can we think about it as relates to now?
Well, let's move forward, as you suggested we do, maybe even chronologically. We have a constitution drafted in secret. It goes out to the states, and each of the states then writes, well, in fact, during the revolutionary period, each of the states, former colonies, now newly independent states. And we should say, by the way, that word state meant a little bit more like nation state to us today. Each of them was given instructions or urgings, at any rate, by the Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, soon to become the Confederation Congress, to write a constitution of their own if they didn't have one. Some kind of internal governing document, because once you've declared your independence from maybe the most powerful and extensive empire in the history of the world to that date, you don't think they're going to let you walk away without a fight, do you?
And most
So-
people didn't consider America American until what, 1812 or so? Yeah, it
Yeah.
wasn't really solidified in people's minds.
So this urging goes out. Write your own constitution. Make your own sort of political society there, or if in the case that it's there already, as it kind of was, you need some code. You need a legal code. You need to codify your political society, and you need to have a governing instrument, because a world of hurt is about to descend on you, and you need order. We're back to Simone Weil, right? Order is the first need of all. So you need to order your communities. Communities are groups of people in common. And some of those early states, in fact, adopt the language of commonwealth, which they kind of borrow from a little earlier period of English history. There was a Commonwealth period in England, if you remember that your English history, in the interregnum period, in between the kings, in between the Charleses. The English cut off the head of the first one, and Oliver Cromwell establishes a commonwealth. Commonwealth. What does that word mean? Common, we know what that means. That's easy. What people have together, what they share. Wealth doesn't mean in that context money, like it does to us. Wealth is from an Old English word, weal, W-E-A-L. That means good. It's the common good. The common good. That's what that society is there to foster and protect and promote. And then so some of our states call themselves commonwealths. Where you are in Arlington, Virginia, where I am right now in Williamsburg, Virginia, in your senior fellows gorgeous library here, filled with books about social contract theory.
I think I see one. There's one back there.
They are. They're here. Trust me. Virginia is a commonwealth, technically. It's not a state, technically. It's a commonwealth.
Right.
Massachusetts is a commonwealth. Pennsylvania, I believe, is a commonwealth. Maybe another. Somewhere in the Midwest, I think. Somewhere in the heart.
Kentucky.
But so a handful of our states are commonwealths, technically. And that is itself, I think, an acknowledgement of a kind of social contractarian understanding of what a community is to be, even in its naming. Now it becomes a little bit more of a sort of academic presence, you might say. And I mentioned John Rawls a little bit earlier. And as historians have tried to understand how that theory has played itself out in practice in American history. And there are debates, the doctors disagree about this. Some of them say, well, it's obvious that there never was a time, in human history when there wasn't community or a social state. But others have pointed out, but by the way, I mentioned this before, I'll say it again. I think all of the Enlightenment thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, the Protestant reformers, slightly before them, all believed literally that there had been a state of nature out of which humanity moved into a state of society. But one thing everybody agreed on was there always seems to be a state of nature in play, even in 2019. What's that? It's the international state of nature, right? We have all of this whole family of nations, always coming into existence or changing and its role, but every one of them is in a state of nature vis-a-vis the others, right? Which is sometimes a state of war, isn't it? As Thomas Hobbes said. Right. And the social contractarians in the 1700s and the 1600s acknowledged this, and even people today admit there isn't any kind of, social contract, is there, between all the individual nation states in the world today? There's not. And there's not a government over us. We don't have an an international government. We take stabs at it now and then, NATO or whomever, or an EU in Europe, but we're all in this state of nature vis-a-vis one another. And we make alliances and pacts, and, we have some allies. It's hard to conceive of us going to war with the United Kingdom, for instance. But I understand that we do have a war plan, even for those people. So state of war, state of nature is a state of war. And that concept, I think, has carried even to this very present moment, at least in international relations theory.
I think that's an interesting point. And I think, too, it makes me think of sort of what's implied in a social contract. So we've been talking about, how government is formed out of that through the consent of individuals. But it also makes me think of the role of the individual within that, right? So the title of our webinar, I think, was "What We Owe to Each Other," right? And I think that's interesting. And I wonder if we could just kind of touch on what is the sort of, call it, the responsibility of the individual within a social contract framework, right? If we consent to a government, I guess, to what extent are we now responsible for ensuring that that government, that's an outgrowth of our society, is staying on a just course, or doing what it ought to do in protecting our rights and keeping us in that state of order?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is a complex one, I think, because the social contract theory can take lots of different shapes. It can go lots of different directions. Let's just take two names we've been tossing around maybe a little bit, a little too loosely. So Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, for instance, they're alive at the same time, so they're contemporaries, but Locke is a full generation younger than Hobbes, and they live and write in the 1600s, in the 17th century. John Locke lives just barely into the 18th century. I think he dies in 1704. But so let's think of them as 17th century, 1600s men. They lived through the English Civil Wars, right? They lived through the Commonwealth period. They lived through the Restoration, and they come to their theorizing with that as a background. And so Thomas Hobbes, for instance, the older of the two, publishes his work, great work, Leviathan, which maybe some of our educators even mention or teach in their classrooms in high school. What is the sovereign like in the Leviathan? Well, the very title of the book, right, it comes from this biblical sea monster.
Yeah.
Hobbes conceived a very powerful, almost omnipotent sovereign or government. Look very, very different from, modern United States, much less United States, say, before the Civil War. And on the other hand, John Locke, I mentioned, is often seen as a kind of grandfather of the American Revolution, the spirit of independence from government tyranny and overweening government, overstepping government. So concepts like republicanism often cluster around the social contract, but they don't have to. Thomas Hobbes comes up with a very, very powerful, overawing sovereign government based on a social contract. He says that initial social contract that moves humans from this state of nature, the brutish and short, violent state of nature where everybody sleeps with one eye open, afraid their throat is going to get slit in the night, their children will be taken or their stuff will be taken. There's one contract between the individuals who will make that society, but there is often seen to be a second contract, and that's between the government and the people. And that's that second stage. So that's why I said it's a little more complex.
Yeah. There's a kind of bilateral nature to it.
Right.
So there's the contract between the people, but then there's the contract between the people and the government. And those are sometimes synchronous and sometimes asynchronous. But I'm actually wondering, we only have a few more minutes to go. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about I don't know if I want to talk about, there are two options. We could either talk about some of the critiques of social contract theory, or how social contracts evolve.
Hmm.
So what I hear you saying is that there was this, that social contract theory is, according to Hobbes even, there was this original contract and it evolved into something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about our current climate and our current context,
Right.
and thinking about how people are perceiving that what is normal, what our relationships to one another are shifting.
Yeah.
And so is that a shift in the social contract? Is that a shift in how we think about what our duty to each other is? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think what it comes down to in a lot of ways is how much do we feel as though our consent is being felt, or how voluntary, or how much are we tacitly consenting, or how much do we feel as though we have choice in that, right?
Yeah.
And that's I think been a lot of the movements toward populism and other things where people are looking for ways of expressing that.
Right.
I think that's a nice way to think about this question of evolution, Rachel. First thing to note is that some notions of a social contract are very old, very ancient. They can be traced all the way back to the natural law thinkers like Cicero, for example, and in the Roman Republican period, that is the period before Rome becomes a decadent empire. So up to about the 1st century BC, from roughly 500 BC to the birth of Christ, roughly that kind of time frame. So the roots are very deep, and you wouldn't say, I don't think, that Rome was perhaps quite as liberal as the United States was before the Civil War, but there's a notion that some things are natural and that there is even a political morality that applies, and there are some things that governments just may not do to their subjects, or better yet, their citizens. So the evolution is a very long one. That would be the first point. It goes back maybe about to 500 BC or so, maybe even farther back than that. But this notion of consent, that does seem to be a very persistent notion within the social contract, whether it's the ancient or the Reformed, that is the Protestant reformers. There's a lot of social contract hammered out in the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in the 1500s, for example. But that notion of consent, it's very persistent. It stays with us to this very day. And Americans, and it might be worth maybe asking in a classroom of your students, do you feel like you give your consent to this government? And if you do, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Yes. We can vote. You can't vote if you're 14 and you're in a middle school classroom, or you're a high school freshman. You can't vote.
Yeah.
There must be some way, right, that you give your consent other than voting. And we deny the vote to tens of millions of US citizens, right? Minors and felons and others. So there must be some way, and Kirk, I think I heard you say it, tacitly, right? Tacitly to consent to your government. Do you consent to it when you receive benefits from it? Or maybe your parents do, or your family members do. Maybe your grandparents are on Social Security, right? And that's a benefit. Is that a way of consenting? Do you consent merely by remaining here? Not leaving, not expatriating, the fancy word for leaving, But it does seem to be that concept of consent really integral, doesn't it, to the social contract? And it goes right back to that theory. If everybody's equal, at least born equal, or created equal, as the Declaration puts it,
Yeah.
then the only legitimate way to get things done will be through consent. Somebody can't now say, I rule by the grace of God, as they said in the old days when people could speak Latin. This is still, you can still see this on coins in the 20th century in Great Britain.
Yeah.
Dei gratia regina, because like for almost the whole century, Queen Elizabeth has been the monarch over there. Or Dei gratia rex, king by the grace of God, queen by the grace of God. even in a monarchical situation like that, there were social contract theorists like Hobbes and Algernon Sidney, another man. By the way, we should have said this earlier. Thomas Jefferson was once asked, "And where'd you get the ideas for the Declaration of Independence?" And he said, "Well, they were just in the air, sort of. It's the harmonizing sentiments of the day. But if you want some authors," he said, "look at Aristotle and Cicero and Locke and Sidney." Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Three pairs. Two ancients, a Greek and a Roman, Aristotle and Cicero. Two modern liberals, Locke and Sidney. And two martyrs, actually. So Cicero and Sidney both have their heads cut off because of their stance for liberty, for a social contract, for saying consent is the only legitimate way for governments to come about.
Well, if that doesn't get your students' attention,
I
I
know.
don't know what will. But I will mention, because I do think that idea of consent and getting students sort of bound into that is something we do think about a lot here at the Bill of Rights Institute. And one of the lessons that we discuss a lot, that we put together, one of our eLessons, asks students to get together and sort of come up with their own rules for the classroom.
Consent to their own rules for the classroom, you might say.
That's right, because then it allows them to have buy-in, and it also gets them thinking about how it is that they are, in fact, in a social contract, even in their classrooms.
And you can find that in the comment section of this video, which will send you over to our website.
That's right.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we are out of time. But Dr. Morrison, thank you so much
for joining us.
For a great conversation, for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm an admirer of the Bill of Rights Institute, so thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We greatly appreciate all the work that you do and for taking time out to be with us today. We will be back in 2 weeks with yet another 10th period webinar. So we'll look forward to having you then. So we'll say so long for now, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.